Welcome to Red Ice Radio Thursdays. This is Henrik Palmgren, your host, coming to you from the west coast of Sweden. Don't forget to check out our websites, red-ice.net, and our soon-to-be-opened redicecreations.com. Also a big thanks to Matthew DeLuz for being with us last week for our premiere of our Thursday shows. And today we have Pam Killeen with us for a very interesting interview, and I think that we should listen to this right away. Today we're going to spend some time on a very important issue. This is something that I kind of have been neglecting for some time. This is about the bird flu, and I posted a few articles on this a while back on the site, and pretty early on came to the conclusion that it basically was all crap. But we shouldn't forget here that there are a lot of people out there who have great fear about this and are basically as traumatized as ever about the bird flu, and the media are still singing to this tune, so to speak, and I suspect that there is a lot more to this story that I'm leaving out here. So I hope we'll hear much more from our guest today, who is Pam Killeen, and she has co-authored together with Dr. Joseph Mercola a new book called The Great Bird Flu Hoax. And if I'm correct, I believe this book has just been released, and we'll hear much more from Pam about this book and the topic. And the main website that you want to keep in mind as we talk here is www.greatbirdfluhoax.com. That's one word, greatbirdfluhoax.com. And then we also have the site for Joseph Mercola, which is mercola.com. That's mercola.com. And I can also mention that Pam has her own website, pamkilleen.com, and her last name is spelled Killeen, pamkilleen.com. So let's bring on our guest and dive into today's program. So welcome, Pam, to the program, and thank you so much for taking time to being with us today.
Thanks so much, Henrik, for having me on your show. It's a real pleasure.
Yeah, wonderful. I know that you are kind of in a media blitz right now, and you're very busy at the moment, I guess. I'm very glad to have you on the program.
Well, it's a very important subject, and I'm very passionate about spreading the word. And you were absolutely correct in your intro about missing pieces to the puzzle. A lot of people are out there grappling at this story, and they're not really sure exactly what to think in some cases. Of course, you're correct in thinking that a lot of people are indeed buying into the fear-mongering campaign, and they're doing things like stockpiling Tamiflu, or they're buying masks or hand sanitizers, or washing their hands more, or what have you.
Yeah.
And there's way more to the story than being able to guard yourself with things like that. It's happening really. If people look at the patterns that have been going on in the last few years, it's been going on for many years, essentially, but lately it just seems more intense, where we have foot and mouth disease, we have SARS and anthrax, we have all these scare campaigns that are going on, and nothing seems to really come to fruition. And, of course, I'm not belittling any deaths that have ensued, even in the bird flu case. I mean, there are people who are indeed dying from this.
Yeah.
But we're missing out on the millions and millions of people that are dying from cancer and heart disease and so many other illnesses that are just not getting the headlines like the bird flu is. And, of course, really, in finding the truth behind the story, you have to follow the money.
Yep.
And unfortunately, I think it's a very insidious story when you follow the money to the pharmaceutical companies, to what I call big chicken, your chicken... large chicken companies, like in the United States, there's Tyson, and so on and so forth. So these are all people who stand to gain from spreading this type of fear campaign.
Interesting. And I thought we could, also begin, if you want to, of course, maybe if you can share a little bit about your background in this field and how you ended up, at this end of the spectrum, so to speak, exposing the fraud and corruption, basically, regarding, these kind of health-related issues.
Well, it's a really long story, and I'll try and give you the Reader's Digest version. But I've been studying health and nutrition for about 20 years independently. And the reason for that is because I was deathly ill for about 12 years with chronic fatigue, fibromyalgia, multiple chemical sensitivities, environmental illness. I was deathly ill, and I had to learn about nutrition on my own because I knew there was nowhere I could go. I mean, every time I asked somebody, they would make me all sorts of promises that I was going to get well doing this or that, and of course, nothing would happen. I'd stay sick. So I had to empower myself and study and question things. I think essentially the reason why society is so sick today is because we're simply not asking enough questions. And I call myself, I'm an investigative reporter, but I think everyone is an investigative reporter or has the potential to be an investigative reporter. You have to learn to ask the right questions.
Yeah.
And when you just start seeing the results, I mean, when you keep seeing the insanity of this health crisis that is going on, especially in the United States, and I'm in Canada, it's happening all throughout North America and even the world. When you see this health crisis, it's simply really a result of people not asking enough questions and settling for the incorrect answers. And so I was fortunate to come across a lot of independent work along my way, and I started applying more and more sound practices, especially nutritional practices, into my life. And fortunately, I was able to get well.
Wow.
And frankly, you say you've been studying Dr. Mercola's site.
Yeah.
And I have a great deal of respect for his work because I'm a huge fan of Sally Fallon and the Weston A. Price Foundation. And I don't know, Henrik, if you're familiar with the work of the Weston A. Price Foundation or not, but
no, I'm not actually.
Dr. Weston A. Price traveled around the world back in the 1920s and 30s, and his goal was to determine the basic characteristics of a healthy diet. And you know, it's so simple. When I saw Sally first speak, I said, "Oh my goodness, this is an epiphany." Really, all we really have to do is go back to basic nutritional values, and I basically summarize it in a simplistic fashion by saying we need to go back to eating like pioneers. And I'm Irish.
Yeah.
Or at least of Irish descent. I live in Canada.
Yeah.
And I think about food the way it was before the First World War.
Yeah.
And farming practices. Of course, they have to tie both in together. They're both intrinsically related. And so I study and I spend a lot of time with farmers and agronomists, and I understand the intimate relationship between the soil and food and that absolute quality that we need in order to maintain or build our health. So Dr. Price wrote a book called Nutrition and Physical Degeneration back in 1939, summarizing what he discovered throughout his world travels. And it's just amazing when you see his work, how simple the answers are, and how the processed food industry has absolutely demonized foods that are healing foods, and foods that have virtually disappeared from our diets. And one sacred food that is very important to our health is butter. And I'm sure you're in Sweden?
Yeah.
In Sweden, I don't know what your butter consumption is like, but when you go to a grocery store in the United States or Canada, you can barely find the butter on the shelves.
Right. I should mention there, actually, I'm actually a vegan, so I don't do butter at all. So.
Yeah, I was a vegan for 10 years.
Ah, you were? Okay.
Yeah, and it didn't work for me whatsoever, but I was 10 years as a vegan and raw foodist, and I really don't, I don't find a lot of people that are very successful at that journey. If you happen to be, you're very unique, and I've been doing this for 20 years. Yeah. And if you're not having side effects from it, you're one of the very few that I found. But I was a vegan for a long, long time. I studied under Dr. Ann Wigmore, and I did raw foods and juicing, and then I said, I kept getting sicker and sicker and sicker. I was really hoping that those food patterns would help me get well, and they didn't. But again, I look at my lineage, and I say I'm Irish, so I eat very much like somebody from Ireland or an Irish Canadian would have eaten, say, 100 years ago. Okay. And fortunately, it worked for me. And and so that ties into Dr. Mercola and how we embarked upon this book, is because it still ties into eating whole foods. You see, it all comes down to eating whole foods. Yeah. And foods that are minimally processed or processed in such a way that you don't really cause damaging effects to the food. And so one thing that we looked at in the food, and I'm sure you know a little bit about this, is the fermented foods. Yeah, sure. And for people who know about building the immune system, some of the most health-giving foods that have ever been on our planet, our ancestors know very much about them, and that is your fermented foods like fermented dairy products, like your kefirs and your yogurts, and of course, going into the vegetables, your fermented vegetables. One very popular food is sauerkraut. And these foods have been used traditionally to even treat dysentery or smallpox. And because of the processed food industry, these foods have basically been obliterated from our diet. Now, in doing research for the book, The Great Bird Flu Hoax, I was curious to know about this connection that came out of Korea. It was a story that came out of Korea, North or South Korea, I can't remember right now, but at any rate, they had some chickens. They had conducted an experiment on chickens, and the chickens were positive for H5N1 virus, the highly pathogenic bird flu.
Yeah.
And the chickens were fed the kimchi, the traditional fermented cabbage, this particular food from Korea. And apparently, in the study, 11 of the 13 chickens recovered from the H5N1 virus in eating this fermented cabbage, kimchi.
Interesting.
So that caught my attention because I know about the healing powers of fermented foods, and I did try to reach these scientists, but unfortunately I didn't have very much luck. But the bottom line is there, though, and it's a very telling bottom line. And I did a lot of research into many different scientific studies done on fermented foods, and there aren't very many because, of course, who's going to fund these studies at the universities? Nobody.
Yeah.
Or very few people, I should say. But there are very few studies on the value of fermented foods. So the studies do validate that these foods can reverse very serious, or have the ability to reverse very serious illnesses. But again, because they've been so lost in our diets, people don't really know to turn to them. They run to antibiotics, or they run to the doctor, and instead of running to food that has very medicinal properties. I mean, imagine eating a food that can reverse smallpox or dysentery, and instead of taking an antibiotic. Nobody's going to tell us about this because there's very little money to be gained. Yeah,
sure. So how is do you know how the process works here, so to speak? Because the bird flu is a virus, correct? Or
it is a virus, and it's very real. It's it is a deadly virus. I believe about 140 people to date, approximately 140 people have died. About double that have contracted the illness. So about approximately half the people who've reportedly contracted the illness have died. Now, the thing that most people need to realize, if people are living in a city, and Henrik, I don't know if you live in a city or on a farm, but chances are you haven't seen a chicken in a while.
That's correct.
Now, what people may be not hearing is that the people who have contracted the illness, the large majority of them have been around live chickens. And secondarily, not only have they been around live chickens, they've been around sick chickens.
Yeah.
So they were at risk, okay, in terms of being in some cases concentrated areas where there's